Anytime.
Okay. So how would you like to be identified in the lower third?
Um, the director of the Equal Justice Initiative or an attorney, whatever works best for your purposes.
Okay, great. So now, 17 years after the Atkins decision, this country is still executing people with intellectual disabilities, and there's a stunning variety of ways that this happens still. And I wondered if you could say, what does that tell us, that these executions are ongoing?
Yeah. Well, we are 17 years past the Atkins decision, and still people with intellectual disabilities are at risk on death rows across this country. And a lot of that has to do with the way in which there's been such resistance to protecting this community. When the Supreme Court made its decision in Atkins, you would have thought that states embrace the notion that we don't want to execute people who have been disabled by disability. It's inconsistent with who we are as a people. But many of the lawyers and prosecutors and folks who implement the death penalty were quite angry about the Atkins decision. They were quite resistant to the court protecting people with that disability from execution, and so they looked for ways to get around it. And they began questioning whether someone was really intellectually disabled in ways that they hadn't before. We had cases where prosecutors had conceded that the defendant suffered from intellectual disability, but as soon as intellectual disability shielded them from execution, there was an effort to question whether they were really intellectually disabled. And so you saw a host of tactics being employed. Well, can that person play basketball? Can they set a pick or a screen or do anything that suggests any kind of complex thinking? And if they can, we believe we should be able to execute them. And this lack of understanding of intellectual disability, this lack of commitment to protecting people with intellectual disability has meant that the burden remains on the intellectually disabled person to overcome all doubts, all arguments about their status in order to be shielded from execution. And in our system, which often treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent, where the burden is on the condemned to get the resources necessary to defend him or herself, a lot of people fail. And people with intellectual disability are particularly vulnerable. It's one of the reasons why the court said we shouldn't execute this population. They're not going to be able to navigate or manage a defense in a way that protects their interests. And so we still have people with intellectual disability at risk of execution on death rows in various states in this country.
And can you talk a little bit about the James Dill execution and how it happened 7 years after the Atkins decision?
I'm going to just ask you to stop for a minute. Switch in the background.
Because that was so heartbreaking to
Mhm.
read about that and the phone call
Mhm.
and what you said about broken people.
Yeah.
You know that the big part of this film is about Jerome Boughton, and I'll ask you about him later. And then we're also doing a contemporary case, the Warren Hill case,
Mhm.
which just happened to be also in Georgia.
Mhm.
It was really
Terrific.
important for the film.
Mhm.
Okay, so
Good to go.
talk about the James Dill.
Yeah, so one of the problems in administration of the American death penalty is that it's shaped by proceduralism. Our courts are in many ways more committed to finality than to fairness. And if you don't object to a constitutional violation at the right moment, in the right way, if you fail to appeal a constitutional violation in the right moment, in the right way, if you don't say the right words, states will argue that you cannot be shielded from execution, you cannot have your rights protected because you have procedurally defaulted on that claim. And if you read appellate opinions in death penalty cases, a lot of these opinions are all about proceduralism. They're all about, was there a timely objection? Was the right motion made? Was the right objection stated? And this proceduralism has basically pulled courts away from actually evaluating the real question: is this person intellectually disabled? Is this person fairly tried? Is this person reliably convicted? Is this person fairly sentenced? And many of the cases, most of the cases that I've worked on where someone ends up being executed are examples of cases where the procedures and the court's commitment to proceduralism is actually barring the court from addressing the substantive issue. And so in many of these cases, the court doesn't address whether someone is intellectually disabled. They don't address whether someone is wrongly convicted or unfairly sentenced or convicted as a result of racial bias or discrimination. They only object whether there was compliance with the procedures. Jimmy Dill was an intellectually disabled man who'd been through the appeals process without the legal assistance he needed to address all the substantive issues in his cases. In his case, when I was contacted by Mr. Dill, he was facing an execution date. He didn't have a lawyer. We intervened, but at that stage in the process, it was going to be very hard to get past all of the procedures. We went to the trial court and said this man is intellectually disabled. The court bans the execution of people with intellectual disability. And the trial court essentially said, too late. Someone should have filed that motion years ago. And we argued, of course, it's not too late. But the court denied our motion for a stay. We went to the other state courts. They said too late. The appeals court said too late. The federal court said too late. Every court said too late. And we got before the United States Supreme Court on the day of the execution, very close to that time. And about 45 minutes before the execution, the court called, and the clerk explained that our motion for a stay of execution had been denied. The court essentially said, too late. No one said he's not intellectually disabled. No one said his sentence conforms with our laws. No one said this is constitutional. They simply said, we're not going to address this claim and frustrate the state's effort to execute someone. And, I think under any circumstance, it's hard to manage the pain and the anxiety of someone who's about to be executed. But it's particularly hard under these circumstances where the courts are unwilling to address the merits of the claim, where they're hiding behind proceduralism, where they've elevated finality over fairness. And I think for people who represent individuals on death row, one of the hardest things you'll ever have to do is to pick up the phone and say, I'm so sorry, but we can't stop this execution. And that's what I had to do for Mr. Dill and for other people who've been in that situation. And it is heartbreaking because I don't believe that if we understood that we are saying something not just about that condemned person who's about to be executed, but ourselves as well, we would be as indifferent to this problem. We'd be as comfortable with seeing people who are severely disabled executed, in part because of that disability, and whether it's intellectual disability or other kinds of acute injuries that I've seen in the population of people that we represent on death row. There are so many people on death row who have been fractured and broken and devastated by mental illness, by abuse, by mistreatment, by cruelty. And when they react in a cruel or an abusive way, we condemn them without any awareness or without any willingness to talk about the circumstances that gave rise to that. I think that's the tragedy of the American death penalty, to be honest. It's that we haven't come to terms with what it means to kill another human being in a legal structure. I don't think the threshold question of the death penalty is whether people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed. I think the threshold question is, do we deserve to kill? And if you have a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent, if you have a system that routinely condemns people to death who are innocent, if you have a system that is compromised by racial bias, that is politicized by arbitrary factors like who's going to win the next election, that is shielded from reliability by this commitment to proceduralism, I don't think you deserve to kill. And there's probably no place in the death penalty discourse where that reality is more evident than in the spaces where you see intellectually disabled people being executed.
What do you think it says about us that we go on doing this?
I think we haven't confronted what a just democracy requires. I think mass incarceration and the death penalty in particular are a product of what I call the politics of fear and anger. In the 1970s, 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the death penalty. They said that it's not being applied in a reliable way. It's arbitrary, it's racially biased, it's discriminatory. The court found that it was like being struck by lightning. And they rooted that finding based on statistics that had been presented by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that showed that race was one of the huge predictors of who got the death penalty. So the court struck it down in Furman versus Georgia. At that moment, there were lots of politicians that were trying to regain footing after the civil rights movement had changed things, after protests were raging against Vietnam War, and they started preaching what I call the politics of fear and anger. They wanted to get tough. They wanted more control. They wanted law and order. And when the Supreme Court made this decision, they were outraged that the court was taking away from various states the death penalty. And so they demanded that the death penalty be restored, and they passed new death penalty statutes. And by 1976, we had a different court with a different consciousness, and the court upheld the death penalty. But you can't understand the modern death penalty or mass incarceration without understanding this political movement led by elected officials toward fear and anger. We've been governed by people who want us to be afraid and want us to be angry. And when you are governed by fear and anger, when you make decisions rooted in fear and anger, you do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. You tolerate inequality. You tolerate injustice. You accept things that would otherwise be unacceptable. And that shaped the modern death penalty. We accepted clear evidence of racial bias and discrimination and said that that's inevitable. We accepted children being executed, even though we understand things about child development. In this country, you can't vote, you can't drink, you can't smoke, you can't do a lot of things until you're over the age of 18. But we said it was okay to execute children 16 and 17 years of age. And we could only justify that by allowing our thinking to be shaped by this politics of fear and anger. And that has given rise to this nation now having the highest rate of incarceration in the world. It's what has allowed us to be in a place where there are 6 million people on probation and parole. It's what has given rise to this new phenomena of the incarceration of women. There's been a 646% increase in the number of women in jails and prisons, 70% of whom are single parents with minor children, which means that we're disrupting the lives of these children as well. And so I think to understand the way in which we have failed to protect people who we say we want to protect, the way we have failed to ensure enforcement of the rights of the accused and the rights of people who are condemned, we have to understand this larger environment, this larger narrative of fear and anger. I think fear and anger are the essential ingredients of oppression, of injustice, of inequality. You go anywhere in the world where people are being abused, if you ask the abusers why they do what they do, they'll give you a narrative of fear and anger. They'll talk to you about how those people don't do this and how those people are that way and this way. And all of the great tragedies in the 20th century where people were killed, the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, have at the core people with power perpetuating narratives of fear and anger that allowed the rest of society to be indifferent to horrific violations of human rights. And in many ways, that's what I see happening in the contemporary death penalty. We're not protecting people the way we said we would. We're not enforcing rights. We're not honoring the constitutional requirements that we said had to be honored to justify the death penalty. The death penalty is a unique punishment. To say to a state that you have the power to kill is to give the state an awesome power and an awesome responsibility. And I just don't think we're holding states accountable for that responsibility by the kind of proceduralism that I see shielding many, the kind of proceduralism giving rise to many of the executions of intellectually disabled people we see today.
Can you make the connection between between slavery to lynching and Jim Crow to
Yeah. Well, I do think it's important that we understand the historical context of the American death penalty. We, almost at the very beginning, became a pretty harsh, punitive society. And that's because we had to forcibly take things. We had to forcibly take land from native and indigenous communities that were here. And that created conflict, and we resolved that conflict often through violence. And to justify the violence, we created these narratives of racial difference. We said that native people are different than Europeans. We said that native people are savages, and we used that rhetoric to justify the violence. And that gave rise to a consciousness of race and color that continues to haunt us until this day. When the first Africans came in 1619 in chains, we justified 250 years of enslavement by saying that black people are different than white people. And slavery was brutal, it was oppressive, it was horrific, it was inhumane, it was tragic. But the worst part of slavery was this narrative we created that black people are inferior to white people, that black people aren't fully human, black people aren't evolved. And this ideology of white supremacy was, for me, the true evil of American slavery. And after the Civil War, when we passed the 13th Amendment, we prohibited involuntary servitude and forced labor, but we didn't do anything to prohibit white supremacy, this ideology. And so that persisted. I've argued that slavery didn't end in 1865, it just evolved. It turned into decades of violence, and we use violence and lynching and terror to maintain the racial hierarchy that was established during slavery. And lynching was a kind of terrorism. It was perpetrated against the entire African American community. We've documented thousands of instances where black people were lynched, but it was millions of black people who were terrorized by that violence. It fostered one of the largest mass migrations in world history when 6 million black people in the American South fled to the North and West, not as immigrants, but as refugees and exiles from terror in that region. And the issues we see today in the urban North and West of generational poverty and underemployment and failing schools and inadequate housing are a consequence of this mass migration where millions of black people went into communities where they were not embraced. They weren't threatened with the same level of violence and lynching, but they were not embraced. And that narrative persisted. And that gave rise to a civil rights movement that tried to overcome that narrative, and we made some progress. We passed some laws that increased the access of black people to vote and to get education, but the narrative still prevailed. And today we're still living at a time where there's a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that gets assigned to black people. Well, when you have the death penalty and black and brown people are presumed dangerous and guilty, what you have to show to prove their guilt is much lower than what you might otherwise have to show. People of color don't go into court with a presumption of innocence. In too many minds, they're in court with a presumption of guilt. And it becomes their burden to prove innocence, not the state's burden to prove guilt. And that's a hard thing to do. And so you're going to have more wrongful convictions. You're going to have higher rates of conviction. You're going to see disproportionate sentencing. And that is very much connected to the modern death penalty. We know in states like Georgia that you're 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white than if the victim is black. We know that if the defendant is black, you're 22 times more likely to get the death penalty. And these disparities are shaped by this larger history that begins with the Native genocide, that's reinforced and crafted during the period of slavery, that is sustained by 100 years of lynching, that is codified by Jim Crow and segregation, and that is very much part of the death penalty that we are implementing today. And so until we understand this history, and until we recognize the shadow it casts over our system, you can question why we would do something as something that requires perfect justice like the death penalty. You know, I've been to Germany and given lectures there, and when I finish the lecture, somebody will stand up, these scholars, and they'll say, well, of course we don't have the death penalty in Germany. And given our history, they'll say it would be unconscionable if we had a death penalty in the nation state of Germany. And when you think about it, that's right. And if we imagine that Germany brought back the death penalty and the people they were executing were disproportionately Jewish, I don't think we could make peace with that. I don't think we could stay silent about that. We would have to react. And yet that's exactly what we do in this country. We've used lethal violence to enslave and to terrorize and to lynch and to segregate and to exclude and to marginalize. And now we have a criminal justice system that uses it to execute. I don't think we should have the death penalty in America, not just because we make so many mistakes, not just because we prey on the vulnerable, the intellectually disabled, the young, the mentally ill. I don't think we should have the death penalty because we have a history of racial violence that disqualifies us from ever using our system of justice to kill people in the way that we kill people. And I don't think it's irrational to say we can't do that. We should not do that when you understand this history of enslavement, lynching, and segregation.
Thank you. Okay. Do you know anything about the numbers of people on death row with intellectual disabilities now and the class and color breakdown?
Yeah,
it's hard to track.
Yeah, it's because in the two areas where we've had categorical protections announced on the death penalty, children and people with intellectual disabilities, in many ways, protecting children was easier because there's not the same kind of subjectivity about someone's age, generally speaking. We know when most people were born, we can assert that age, and we can protect kids from execution. With intellectual disability, it's a more complicated set of metrics. There has to be onset by the time the person is an adult. There are aspects of it that have to be manifest in ways where it's a continuum and you have to be on one part of that continuum. Because of that subjectivity, it's hard to know in any reliable way what the numbers of intellectually disabled people are when it comes to the death penalty. But because we have such poor lawyering in so many of the jurisdictions that produce a lot of death sentences, where the lawyers don't investigate intellectual disability, they don't present evidence about it, we know that there are still lots of people with intellectual disability on death row. The estimate in 2000, in the early part of the 21st century, was that we were looking at something around 1%. And I think that that in terms of the people who had been who were pending at a particular time, the estimate for people on death row was something like 10%. I think we're still in that 5 to 10% category. So we could be talking about a couple of hundred people or more who would meet the criteria, meet the definition that the court has articulated of someone with intellectual disability.
And do you know anything about the race and class distribution?
Well, there's no question that because race is still one of the prime factors in who gets sentenced to death, that intellectual disability is disproportionately going to present itself in communities of color, people of color. And for a combination of reasons, people of color have less access to the healthcare systems where these diagnoses will be made at developmental stages and therefore can be addressed, but also because there are certain cultural biases that play into how we think about intellectual disability. If you presume somebody is dangerous or guilty just because of their color. You don't worry about whether they're also ill, or they're also disabled, or they're also struggling with some challenge. You just focus on the dangerous and guilty part. And because that is a presumption that gets assigned to black and brown people, it becomes an obstacle for establishing intellectual disability. So I do think we see it more frequently among prisoners of color than we do in other communities. But we have all kinds of people. You just have to be poor to be at risk of being condemned despite intellectual disability.
Could you say, I love that sentence of yours about the opposite of poverty.
Yeah. I think we have a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. I don't believe that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I believe that the opposite of poverty is justice. And we can only deconstruct the conditions that give rise to poverty by committing more fundamentally to justice.
Thank you. Okay. Let's see. I'm trying to do this by 3 o'clock. Could you talk a little bit about some of the specific realities that you described so beautifully in the book of what it's like to be on death row and you smell the executions and
Yeah, I think what most people don't appreciate is that to condemn someone is to say that their life has no value, that they're beyond hope, they're beyond redemption, they're beyond purpose and meaning. There is no way they can be redeemed, no recovery. And that's a pretty painful thing to say about someone. And I think what bothers me a lot about the American death penalty is the way communities of faith who are deeply engaged in this view that redemption is always possible, that recovery is always possible, have been so silent about this practice of saying these people are beyond redemption, beyond recovery. And at least theoretically, the American prison movement has been rooted in this notion that we can do something correctional. And for a while, we offered education, we offered programming, we tried to help people recover in a way that would allow them to re-enter society and not be a threat. And we've retreated from a lot of that, but that's still at least nominally part of how we think about incarceration. For people on death row who are just waiting to be executed, we don't engage in any of that. We don't try to treat, we don't try to help, we don't try to support, we don't try to manage the pain and anguish of being condemned. We just warehouse people and we tell them, we'll execute you soon. And every day the state uses all of its resources to try to kill that person. Well, that is its own kind of challenge. And when you're part of this small community of people who have been condemned, where depending on what state you're in, every few weeks or every few months, you see someone walk down the tier and strapped into an electric chair and burned to death, or laid out on a gurney and killed with poisons, or put in a gas chamber and suffocated, or shot by a firing squad, or hanged, or whatever the method of execution is, it adds to the despair and I think to the trauma of condemnation. The Privy Council, which governs Commonwealth nations, has ruled that it is violative of human rights to keep someone on death row in this state of anxiety and concern about death for more than 5 years. The average length that death row prisoners in this country spend on death row is well over 16 years. We have people on death row that have been there for over 30 years. And so the conditions, the solitary confinement, the absence of programming, the lack of human contact with people on the outside, add to, in my judgment, the cruelty of capital punishment. In some states that use the electric chair, my state of Alabama, for example, the rest of the row was close enough to the execution chamber that many of my clients would complain about smelling the flesh burning when they would strap people into the chair and execute them. We've had these horrific instances where executions have gone wrong, where people caught on fire, where the electrodes weren't properly plugged in and the person didn't die right away and had to be electrocuted multiple times. And despite these graphic and violent state-sanctioned killings, we have continued, as Justice Blackmun said, tinker with the machinery of death. There's new concerns about lethal injection and about whether it's humane, because we've seen people shake and struggle and writhe and try to get off the table after being injected with these toxins in obvious pain and distress. And still, we persist. So yes, I think there is something extra that we are doing in the death penalty context by condemning people to conditions of confinement that are often brutal and inhumane, and subjecting people to processes where it's not just the death sentence that will kill them, but it's the multiple ways in which we are traumatizing and abusing this population of people. And it doesn't matter whether they committed the crime. We are supposed to be better than the offenders that we claim to punish. It's not an excuse to say, oh, well, they committed a violent crime, so they deserve that. It's about us, not just about them.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I think the degree to which they suffer on death row is really torture.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely,
So
yeah.
that's not okay. Did you know Jerome Bowden, or I know you knew about him?
Yeah,
Right.
so I was...
Here it is.
Yeah, so I was practicing in Georgia when Jerome Bowden was on death row. I started working full-time in 1985, about a year before his scheduled execution. And so I never met him, but I was working with a lot of people on the row who knew him. And when the issue of his execution came up, we worked with many of the people on that team to create this consciousness about why it would be so wrong to execute somebody with intellectual disability. And I think the tragic thing about the Bowden execution is that, when the doctors would come and see him to evaluate him, he would try so hard to make them accept him, to do what they wanted him to do. He didn't have an understanding that it wasn't in his interest to try that hard. And in many ways, they exploited his intellectual disability to even get the results that they used to justify his execution. I think it was one of the first executions that impacted communities outside of the criminal justice space, outside of the small community people who had been fighting against the death penalty, because it raised this question of, are we being cruel? Are we exploiting and taking advantage of vulnerable people? Is this right to take someone with this disability and execute them in part because of that disability? And it did begin the modern effort at ending the death penalty or shielding people with intellectual disability from the death penalty.
When the psychologist who tested him at the behest of the Board of Pardons and
Right.
Paroles, whatever he told the board came out and said to the media, oh, his IQ is 71. But it was clear from the article that wasn't his full scale IQ.
Right.
It was below 70.
That's right.
And the board will not give us the data.
Interesting.
We've tried.
Yeah.
For years.
Interesting.
Okay, so
Were you able to talk to the expert?
I guess he'd had a stroke by the time I reached him on the phone.
Oh, is that
He
right?
said he didn't have the records anymore, and he said, I got death threats because of that case. That was it. Okay, so let's see. I'm trying to skip over because you already answered a lot of these, so that's great. Can you talk about on page 290 of your book? You said there's no wholeness outside of our reciprocal humanity. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think we have not really asked important questions about what it means to punish, why we punish. And I really think they're important questions for a society to ask. What are we trying to do? Are we just angry and we want to hit somebody back? Are we trying to help people recognize what's acceptable and what's not acceptable? Are we doing it for the offender? Is it just about revenge and retribution? What are we trying to achieve? And I think if we were more honest about our own humanity, we would have a very different response. We'd have a very different approach to these questions. None of us want to be judged by our worst act. I believe we're all more than the worst thing we've ever done. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if someone takes something, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. And it's important that we understand the other things you are before we judge you. And we all want mercy. We all want grace. We all want forgiveness when we make a mistake. That's human nature. We can't assure anybody that we'll never make mistakes, or that we'll never mess up, or that we'll never say the wrong thing. And so we want that space to exist. And I just think if we want that for ourselves, we have to be willing to give it to other people. And those who are condemned, those who are accused, those who are imprisoned have to think about this a lot. And I just think if the rest of us would think about it more, we wouldn't be so confident that it's right to execute people, that it's right to condemn people to die in prison, that it's right to take away all hope of recovery or restoration or relief from any human being. There are places in the world where life without parole is considered completely unacceptable. It's too extreme. Of course, most places don't have the death penalty. And the question becomes, why do we do that here? We've worked on cases involving very young children. That era of fear and anger resulted in states lowering the minimum age for trying children as adults. I represent 13 and 14-year-old kids sentenced to die in prison, life imprisonment, whatever. Why do we want to do that to a 13-year-old? We know that children, by their very nature, will change. And why do we want to just take away what that change might do to that person's capacity to live in the free world? And so I think it reflects a fundamental lack of attention to our own humanity. I really do believe that we all need mercy. We all need redemption. We all need unmerited grace. And if we need it for ourselves, we have to be willing to give it to other people. And I look at the American criminal justice system, and it at times seems painfully absent, painfully devoid of any commitment to mercy or grace or redemption. And I think ultimately that condemns us. I think it takes away our commitment to human rights and human dignity. It makes us severe and abusive and cruel in ways that are not going to be sustainable.
Have you ever, or if so, how often, known someone who was on death row, and especially who had an intellectual disability, who didn't have a horrific history of being abused, tormented?
Yeah, I've never known anybody on death row with or without intellectual disability who didn't get to death row without a lot of abuse and hardship. The people on death row are the poor. They are the marginalized. They are people who have seen a lot of violence. There are people who have been hurt a lot. There are people who have seen violence. There are people, many of them, who were born into violent families. They lived in violent neighborhoods. They were shaped in a crucible of violence. Most are suffering from disability and mental illness. I've never met anybody on death row who didn't have a mitigation story that was heartbreaking, that was tragic. And we failed, in my view, to intervene, to protect, to provide the kind of care and service that people needed. And as a result of that failure to intervene, something happened. These broken people with tragic lives reacted in tragic and violent ways, and that just created more suffering. I hate violence. I'm against all violence. It's not like I'm trying to excuse violent behavior. I don't want anybody to be killed, to be murdered, to be raped, to be assaulted, to be kidnapped. It's heartbreaking. But we are failing when we do not intervene in the lives of people who are being traumatized and abused and oppressed and starved and mistreated, knowing that at some point that will manifest itself in some way that could be very violent. And that's why, for me, if we were serious about public safety in this country, we'd stop wasting the millions of dollars we're spending to execute a handful of people, and we'd start investing that money in trying to do something about changing the behaviors that give rise to crime.
And everything you said, of course, applies to Warren Hill.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, we'll do that right. When I heard about the 2 crimes he committed, I thought I've rarely heard anything so horrific.
Mm-hmm.
And then I heard about his child.
Mm-hmm.
Just.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you said on page 294 of the book, the power of just mercy is that it belongs to the undeserving.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just talk about that for a minute?
Sure. I think we have this consciousness that if people do the right things, if people present in the right way, then we'll consider mercy for them. But it's something they have to earn. They have to show us they deserve. When, in my view, true mercy, just mercy, is what we give to the undeserving. It's not about them, it's about us. It's about our willingness to believe that redemption is better than revenge, that forgiveness is better than retribution, that the possibility of restoration and love is better than hate. And I don't believe we have really imagined what that means when it comes to criminal justice. And that's why we see some of the punishments that we see. 3 strikes, you're out. It may work in a baseball game, but it doesn't work in life. To reduce someone's fitness to be fully human to whether they've made a mistake more than 3 times is to misperceive the complexity of human nature. And that's why I would love to see us talking more about grace. I'd love to see us talking more about mercy. Our system is a hopeless system. You look at these laws and it's clear that the people who pass them are pretty hopeless about what we can do with children, what we can do with people with intellectual disability, what we can do about mental illness, what we can do about poverty, what we can do about addiction and what we can do about drug dependency. And I don't believe we can solve the problems that we face in this country if we are shaped and governed by hopelessness. I think hopelessness is the enemy of justice. I think injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And if we're going to become the great nation that we claim to be, then we're going to have to be willing to imagine things we haven't seen, to be more hopeful about what we can do, even for the folks. And I think we make this mistake of judging our commitment to the intellectually disabled and our commitment to children and our commitment to certain populations by looking at how well we treat the talented kids and the privileged kids and the gifted kids, the people with disabilities who are nice and affluent and have never made any mistakes. We'll look at white and look how we treat, when in fact our commitment to managing these problems, our commitment to children has to be expressed in how we treat kids who are abused and neglected and have made mistakes and are in jails and detention facilities. Our commitment to intellectual disability has to be measured by what we're doing for the people who are intellectually disabled, who are poor and disfavored and suffering from addiction and dependency, people of color, undocumented people with intellectual disability. That's the community of intellectually disabled people that ultimately reveals our commitment to addressing intellectual disability. And through that metric, we're doing really poorly. We're not doing what we say we are doing to be a nation that is compassionate toward those with great needs.
One of the things that just occurred to me after being immersed in your work is that I know there's a lot of research showing that people who don't like or are afraid of another group, if you put them in the presence of somebody from that group, they're human and we have these things in common. And I thought, I wonder if there's any way to have every school child learn about the history of these people who were on death row. Take every legislator and every judge in the country at every level to death row and have them listen.
Well, that's very much, I mean, for me, proximity is a really important concept that is critical if we're going to create the kind of understanding and knowledge that we need. In our museum, we have an exhibit where we ask visitors to come and sit down, and it replicates a prison. And you sit down and you pick up the phone, and a person on the other line is there, and you listen to the stories of condemned people on death row and children sentenced to life without parole and women who have been sentenced to decades of imprisonment. And that narrative, that exchange, that interaction is one of the most powerful parts of our museum experience, and we've heard from so many people. And I do think replicating that for our policymakers, for our decision makers, is key to responsible decision making. I mean, in science, what's interesting to me is intimacy, proximity is key. No scientist thinks that they can solve decades-old problems of chemistry or biology. We're not going to understand the human genome by not looking very carefully. You have to be really intimate. Innovation comes from being so close to what you're studying, to being so inside of what you're seeing and knowing the nuances and details that you can find something that hasn't been found before. Well, I think justice is the same way. We have to get closer to people who have been incarcerated, who've been arrested, who've been convicted, who have been condemned, if we truly want to understand what it means to challenge and overcome the problems that gave rise to that condemnation. And I don't think we've done very much of that in this country.
Well, I love what you just said about what's in the museum. Is there any way, conceivably, do you want, I got
No, I'm okay.
Is there any way conceivably to get the judges and the legislators to do that?
Well, I think, I don't know that, the problem that we have in this country on so many of these issues is that we have to do what we try to do without power. I look at truth and justice work, truth and reconciliation work in other countries. And in South Africa, they could have truth and reconciliation because with the collapse of apartheid, the black majority was empowered to shape things. The community who was targeted by the Rwandan genocide, the Tutsi, were ultimately able to regain military control over that nation, and so they could facilitate reparational justice. The Germans lost the war. If the Germans had won, if the Nazis had prevailed, there wouldn't be a Holocaust memorial in Berlin. There wouldn't be this attention to... And the difficulty we have in this country is that the people who have been burdened with this history of slavery and lynching and segregation, the poor, the disfavored, are still disempowered. And so we're asking people with power to respond to this human crisis, even though they don't absolutely have to. So yes, I would love policymakers and decision makers and judges to come into our spaces, to visit us at our sites, but I can't require it. And so there has to be this effort, this human effort. I mean, Dr. King tried to do it through nonviolence, and it was very powerful and in many ways very effective. We have to do it through the tools that we have available to us: storytelling, filmmaking, journalism. And I do hope there's a concern about the integrity of what we do in our justice system that motivates people to take a closer look. But ultimately, our nation is the kind of nation that has to take a step toward what's right, what's moral, what's just, what's required to be a decent democracy, and not just what's comfortable, what's convenient, what you can do. And it's a long answer to this question of can we get them to come, but I think ultimately it's going to turn on a willingness to face the truth of what we've been doing in this system for a long time.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I just have to ask you one other thing.
Sure.
Um, what happened in your family that helped you become this kind of person that you are?
I was shaped by people who believed things they hadn't seen. My great-grandfather was enslaved in Virginia. He learned to read at 12, even though it could have cost him his life. And so reading and education was really important in my family. My grandmother would tell stories about how after emancipation, all of the black people would come over to their house, and my great-grandfather would read the newspaper each night. And it was so exciting for her that he knew how to do that she wanted to learn how to read. And of course, she didn't have formal education, but she learned to read. And my mother was an avid reader, and we were poor. But my mom went into debt so that we could have the World Book Encyclopedia in our house. And that created this relationship to words and knowledge that I've always valued. And that was a tremendous gift that my mother and grandmother and great-grandfather gave me that has been key to my work. But they also gave me this gift of hopefulness, this instruction to never doubt that you can do the things that must be done, to believe things we haven't seen, because in many ways, the work that I do is work that is possible because I'm standing on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. I'm not confused about that dynamic. I live in Montgomery, Alabama, where the hearts and souls and spirits of Edie Nixon and Joanne Robinson and Rosa Parks and Dr. King and Johnny Carr animate the work that I do every day. And they were folks who had to frequently say, my head is bloodied but not bowed. I've never had to say that. And yet their willingness to persevere and to persist and to fight despite the hardship, the threats, the menace, the blood, teaches me that there's a lot more that we can do than we sometimes think. And that's why I fight for the condemned and the incarcerated and the accused. That's why I believe that we have to find ways to increase the justice quotient in our society. That's why I believe that there will come a time when we do not execute people in this country. The death penalty will not last forever. I believe truth crushed to earth ultimately rises again. It takes a while sometimes. But there will be a time in American history when we will look back on this era when we were executing the poor and the frail and the condemned and the intellectually disabled like Jerome Bowden, and we'll just be confused how a decent society could do something like that. We're not at that time yet. But to get there, if we push and we challenge and we struggle, we can make that happen. And that's the gift I was given. My great-grandfather never imagined. He couldn't know for certain that he would be free, and yet he imagined freedom. And I'd like to think they'd be proud of me because I don't think they could have known that any of their progeny could be a lawyer, fight the battles that I'm fighting, but here I am. And I think that's at the heart of what we're trying to do in this space.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And this film, we'll send you a copy, of course,
Okay.
to do with whatever you want.
Yeah.
We hope that can be a little bit of what you're trying to
Sure.
do. I'd also love to send you, the first film I ever made was a 17-minute